Greetings and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to look at how to manage the engine in the legendary P-51 Mustang, so stick around. Alright, now depending on what you have as far as flight controls go for your particular setup, we want to make sure of a few things before we jump into the cockpit, especially if you are new to warbirds. So we go up here to the options menu, come over here to special, and scroll down and find the P-51. Or if you're just trying this out and are using the TF-51, you can go there as well. But if you have rudder pedals, I highly recommend you turn off the auto rudder, as sometimes this will mess you up thinking that you have applied one input and the computer is trying to help you out and do something else. It certainly doesn't help, especially on critical maneuvers like takeoff. And speaking of takeoff, if you do have rudder pedals, I also recommend turning off the takeoff assistance. This has definitely hindered me when I was learning how to fly this particular bird. And it is unnecessary, in my opinion, if you have rudder pedals. Now, if you have a twist stick for your rudder axis, or even a rudder rocker, or potentially no rudder input at all, I recommend you play around with the setting and find something that will work for your particular setup. But like I said, if you have pedals, highly recommend you turn both of these off. Alright, and welcome back everybody, and today, like I said in the intro, we're going to look at how to manage the engine in the awesome P-51 Mustang. If you are new to warbirds, I know they can be intimidating because they are very challenging to fly, in addition to having to take care of an engine. They're certainly not as easy to hop into like any of the jets. However, hopefully we can take some of the mystery out of running the engine. If you're looking to get into warbirds and you don't have one yet, feel free to hop into the TF-51 trainer that comes packaged within DCS. It's free and available, and it flies just like the P-51. It just doesn't have any armament or the gas tank that's sitting right behind the pilot seat like the P-51 has, which greatly extended its range. We'll cover fuel here in a little bit. Alright, so let's look at all the controls. We'll start over here on the left-hand side of the cockpit. First thing I want to point out is all of the convenient placards that North American Aviation installed in the cockpit to help the pilot out. Right here below the canopy rail to the rear, you see the dive limitation, the diving speed limits, and also a speed restriction for various flight regimes. Maximum diving speed, diving RPM for the engine, max speed, you can lower the gear, and also the flap restrictions, as you can see here on these two placards. Alright, moving forward and down towards the consoles, that yellow handle at the rear, that is your flap handle. And unlike a lot of the other fighters where you had an up, down, and neutral position, in the Mustang, you set the particular angle, and it will go in 10-degree increments from 0 down to its max deflection of 50 degrees. So all you have to do is set the handle into the position that you want, and the hydraulics takes care of the rest. Moving a little more forward, we have two levers that are side by side under the carburetor air control. The lever on the left controls whether or not you're getting ram air down the nose scoop that's just underneath the propeller, or you're using the air filter. In normal operation, this is set for ram air, and you set it for filter air if you're operating in dusty environments or off of a grass or dirt airstrip. The lever to its right is the carburetor heat control. Normally this is set forward to cold air. However, if you suspect that you may be having carburetor icing, you set this to the rear, and that'll help melt out the ice that's accumulating in the carburetor throat. But like I said, its normal position is forward. Alright, moving a little further forward than the carburetor air control levers, we have the three trim wheels, and you have a trim wheel for rudder, aileron, and your elevator right there on the side of the wall. Directly above that, we have radiator and oil cooler controls. kind of similar to the P-47 where you had the intercooler doors and the oil cooler doors. All right, these switches operate slightly differently than the ones in the P-47. They have these black guards that hold them in the up automatic position. You can flip them down and you're able to set them into different positions to either open or close the doors manually, or if it's in the center position so that they stop moving entirely. Here on screen you can see the doors you're controlling. This is the rear of the scoop that's down on the belly of the aircraft. The large door is for your radiator. The smaller door, which is difficult to see even when it's wide open like this one is, that is your oil cooler door, and that's the two that you are controlling with those two switches. Unlike the P-47 though, you do not have any mechanical indicators letting you know the position of the doors. In flight, you just have to go off of what your gauges are reading and adjust the doors from there if you're in manual mode. If not, you can let the automatic controls help you out with that. Just forward of those two switches, you got the landing light control switch. And then forward of that, you have a knob that controls some of your cockpit lighting to help see at night. Moving slightly forward and above, you have the throttle quadrant, where you have your main throttle, propeller lever, and that red handled knob is your mixture control, and it only has 3 positions. Right now it's in idle cutoff. One setting forward is the run position. That is the normal position for this lever whenever your engine's running. The third position is the emergency rich. This is a mode that is used if you have a carburetor failure or you have combat damage and has knocked out your carburetor. What this does is it is a bypass for the carburetor that'll get fuel into your engine, but it only meters in at a fixed rate. So it is not very efficient as far as your fuel usage goes. However, it will normally help keep your engine running, like I said, in case of combat damage. And it is only meant as an emergency position to get you home. Alright, looking a little forward and at the bottom of the center console, and I'll move the stick out of the way, we have the main fuel panel. You got this red lever here on the left that is your main fuel on-off valve. That'll have to be on prior to engine start. This knob here is your tank selector. So the P-51 has 3 internal tanks. You have one in each wing, so you got your left wing tank, right wing tank, and the fuselage tank, which sits behind the pilot. You can also select drop tanks if you have them fitted right wing and left wing. Now the TF-51 will not have the fuselage tank. The space that it occupies behind the pilot's seat is the tank was removed to make room for a second seat for an instructor pilot. The red pull handle off to the right, that is your hydraulics release. If you needed to release the hydraulic pressure in the system, you would pull that handle. And just below that is your primary hydraulic pressure gauge. Directly above that in the center console, this is primarily dealing with your weapon systems. However, off on the upper left is your ignition control for your magnetos. So you got your right, left, and both magnetos enabled. So this effectively is your ignition switch. Alright, looking at the instrument panel now, at the bottom left, these are some important switches down here. The red guarded switch is your supercharger speed control. Normally it is set to down and automatic. However, you can toggle it into the high speed blower setting, but it's a held switch. You have to hold it in that position, and is primarily meant for testing. The light to its right will light up yellow whenever the supercharger is in its high speed setting. Alright, the other toggle switches that we have here is the fuel boost pump. That is an electric pump that's in each tank to help send fuel up to the engine's engine-driven pump. So you actually have 2 fuel pumps on the aircraft, the electric pumps and the engine-driven pump. Normal operation, you leave the fuel boost pump on. If you forget to turn that on and you do any aerobatics or hard maneuvers, your engine will start to stumble from fuel starvation because it's unable to draw the required amount of fuel on its own. So you need the fuel boost pumps. All right, oil dilute is the next switch, and that'll actually squirt raw gasoline into the engine to help thin out the oil. Very useful for any sort of wintertime setting missions when it's really cold outside to help thin down the oil. All right, the next red guarded switch is the starter switch, and you have to flip the red guard up in order to actually toggle the starter. And lastly is the primer switch. This is a very handy feature. It is an electrically operated primer, unlike the one in our P-47 in DCS. Alright, so let's cover engine instruments. You'll notice on the dashboard that there is a very prominent yellow line. Everything that's on the inside of that yellow line, so everything below and to the left of that line, is your primary flight instruments. So you got airspeed, your gyro compass, your artificial horizon, altimeter, turn and bank coordinator, and your vertical speed indicator. Just below your turn coordinator is your landing gear indicators. So you got a green light that indicates that the gear is down and locked, a red light for when the gear is in transit, either up or down, and if both lights are extinguished, your gear is up and locked. All right, moving over to the right hand side of the instrument panel, we'll start at the top. We have a suction gauge that indicates that the engine's vacuum pump is producing suction for some of your instruments that require vacuum in order to operate properly. To its right is your manifold pressure gauge. We'll be referencing that a lot, and currently it is indicating our atmospheric pressure that's just outside the out in our environment right now. Below that is our coolant gauge. That is the temperature of the coolant that is helping keep the engine cool. Down and to its right is your engine RPM gauge. That's just how fast the engine's actually turning. Below that is the carburetor air temperature gauge. Normally this is in the green, and you don't really have to... this is something I look at every couple of minutes, but there's nothing you really interact with too much unless you're in cold conditions and you are worried about carburetor icing. If that needle is starting to drop towards zero, you may want to, and your engine's starting to run rough, you may want to engage your carburetor heat in order to help keep your engine running smoothly, help melt any of that ice. Below that and to the right, this is a very important gauge, the triple gauge, just like the P-47. So it's got 3 gauges in one. The larger of them, which spans the entire upper half of the gauge, this is your oil temperature, and this is the one that tends to move around the most, and this is the one I tend to operate the oil cooler doors more frequently than the radiator door. Below that and to the left is your oil pressure gauge, and off to the right is the fuel pressure gauge. Alright, and then at the very bottom of the instrument panel you have your oxygen blinker, letting you know that your pilot is alive and breathing and using the oxygen system, and then off to the right is how much oxygen is remaining in your oxygen tanks. Alright, looking at the right hand side of the instrument panels, up at the front is your oxygen regulator with the oxygen handle. Normally this is flipped down for its normal position. I don't have to mess with this too terribly much. This red handle here is your emergency canopy release, so if you're getting ready to bail out, this is what will jettison your canopy. The window crank here is what slides your canopy forward or back to open it. Just underneath that is our primary electrical panel. The gauge right here at the top, this is our generator output that's driven by the engine. At low RPM, this, just like the P-47, there's not enough speed on the generator to actually produce a useful output. So you have to wait until your engine is at a higher RPM before this actually starts producing electricity. So whenever you're doing ground handling or you forgot the generator switch, your battery is supplying all the electrical power to the aircraft, and depending on what you have running, you could run the battery dead. And speaking of the generator, underneath it is your row of toggle switches. The very first one is your generator switch. The battery switch is the next one to the right. The third switch is your gun heat. So if you are up at higher altitudes or in wintertime conditions, to prevent the gun actions from freezing, you would need to turn on the gun heaters. The fourth switch is your pitot probe heat. And then the last two are your position lights, so your wing and your tail navigation lights, and you can set them to bright or dim. The three toggle switches at the bottom are for recognition lights, and that is three different colored lights. You got red, green, and amber underneath the right-hand wing for signaling people on the ground, and you can use them with the little blinker key. Used in wartime for ground signaling to help identify yourself to the guys on the ground. Not terribly useful in DCS, but it is there nonetheless. Another useful thing on the right hand side is your radio. You got a 4-channel radio right here on the left hand side of the cockpit. You just pick your channels here with the 4-lettered keys. Otherwise, you leave that off. I do recommend leaving this off for ground operations, because this will draw electrical power. And lastly, we got another one of those very useful placards, and this one has to deal with running the engine. So you don't necessarily have to memorize all the various RPMs and manifold pressure settings. North American Aviation, again, gave you a handy little chart that has every detail that you need. So you got your takeoff settings, war emergency power, military power, your maximum continuous power setting, and also your maximum cruise engine settings. Gives you your takeoff conditions. You want your oil to be 15 degrees C minimum, minimum of 60 pounds of oil pressure, and your coolant needs to be at least 60 degrees C. You got your temperature limitations over on the right hand side of this chart, so for your coolant, oil temperature, and various pressures. Alright, so that is the cockpit tour. Let's move on to doing startups. Alright, so for starting the engines, now we need to set our controls as follows. We look down here on the center of the instrument panel towards the bottom, and we have the parking brake handle. Extremely useful feature. Not all warbirds have this. So in order to engage that, there's even a set of instructions off to its right. But pull and hold the handle out. Push the toe brakes down for about 3 seconds. Release the toe brakes. Release the parking brake handle. If you did it right, the handle will stay locked out, and your parking brake is now set. If the handle retracted in, then you got something out of sequence, or you didn't hold the toe brakes down long enough, and you gotta try again. But incredibly useful feature. I absolutely love that, because I don't have to hold the brakes the whole time while we're warming up the engine. Alright, our flaps are down fully, so the handle is also fully down. That's good. Alright, we are on grass and dirt right now, so I'm going to leave the carburetor air control in filtered air. Cold air for the temperature. One thing you definitely want to do is drop the guards over your radiator controls and set these to neutral. Landing light off, trims to neutral. We've got to crack the throttle about 1 inch. Propeller lever full forward. Mixture to idle cutoff. We want to turn our main fuel tank valve on. Ensure that we're on the left-hand tank for ground operations. Look around on the controls. Everything's looking good. Alright, now we can turn on our battery. And we see the cockpit instruments start to come to life. And we got our landing gear down and locked indication. Alright, first thing we want to do is turn on the fuel boost pump. And then look over here on the fuel pressure gauge. We got about, looks to be about 12-13 pounds. We're right there in the green. That is excellent. Alright. Remember what I said earlier, that your radiator controls do not have any sort of mechanical indications. This is the only time you'll really hear these, because the engine will overpower the noise from your doors. But right now we want to make sure that both our radiator and oil cooler doors are set to wide open. So hold the switch, and you can hear them. You can hear them run until they stop. Once they stop, they're at their full open position. All right, they are both fully open. All right, so now we're ready to crank up the engine. And there's a few different ways to do this. The technique I've adopted is very similar to what current warbird operators will tend to do. And briefly, that is to get the engine rotating with no fuel, get the ignition on, and then introduce fuel with the primer. So basically, you're going from no fuel to a known fuel quantity. You can prime the engine before starting. However, if you over-prime the engine, you risk either flooding it and it not starting, or even worse, an engine fire. And that is modeled in DCS. So if you over-prime the engine, you definitely risk an engine fire. All right. So this technique will involve both hands. The default keyboard key is home to engage the starter. So let's take a peek at this. So we'll get the engine cranking. Set the ignition to both. Primer. Now once the engine fires, I can let go of the starter. It'll stay running on the primer. And then I can set the mixture control to run. Get on the throttle once it starts and set for 1200 RPM for warm-up. Immediately check the oil pressure gauge. We got a rise in oil pressure. That's looking good. Manifold pressure dropped slightly. Suction pressure has risen. Alright, everything's looking good. And then lastly, look down at our hydraulic pressure gauge, and it came up to about 1,000 psi. That looks fantastic. Now we can raise the flaps. Left side's coming up. Right side's coming up. We got a small drop in hydraulic pressure now that they're in transit. Once they stop, that'll come back up. Awesome. Alright. Now we just sit around and wait. What we're waiting for now is our oil temperature, that's the upper span of the triple gauge, to reach a minimum of 40 psi before we start taxing. So we'll wait for that, and I'll see you guys in a few minutes. Alright, now we are at 40 degrees C on the oil temperature. Oil pressure's looking good. Everything else is looking fine. Alright, now let's move on to taxiing. Now this is the easiest warbird as far as ground handling goes. You have differential brakes to help with steering. You have a lockable tail wheel. And as a bonus, the tail wheel is also steerable. So in my opinion, this is the best warbird as far as ground handling characteristics go. So let's go ahead and get ready to taxi. Drop the step on the toe brakes. We'll release the park brake. And now that we're above 40 degrees C, we can advance the throttle past 1200 RPM. Just get rolling, bring it back down to 1200. And we need to go the other direction, so just kick in some right rudder for steering. Control my ground speed. Now, if you're using the tail wheel steering only in it, which is engaged by using the rudder pedals, if you're only using the rudder pedals, you're swing a much wider circle because of the limited amount of travel that you get using the tail wheel alone. But just like all warbirds with that are tail draggers, it's difficult to see where you're going, so you gotta do a little bit of S-turns and just look out the window as far as where you're going. Make sure you're not gonna hit anything. Alright, so now I'm approaching the end of the runway and I have to turn around. We saw how wide the turn circle was using the tail wheel steering alone, so if we want to swing a tighter turn, we push the stick forward to unlock the tail wheel and give it a little bit of differential brake. And now we can swing a tighter turn. If we bring the stick back aft, the tail wheel will relock once it gets to its centering position. Back to 1200 RPM. Alright, what we're going to do next prior to takeoff is our run-up. So you can either set the parking brake for this or just stand on the toe brakes. I tend to do it either way. But what we want to do is hold the stick all the way back. We want to make sure our generator is turned on so we can check that. And what we're going to do now is run the engine all the way up to 2300 RPM. Alright. Manifold pressure stable, 2300 RPM. Oil pressure is just a touch high because we're still a little bit cold, but that's okay for right now. Now what we want to do is cycle the propeller all the way aft, and we should see a drop in RPM. The shaking's a little normal, that's it going to a very wide pitch. Bring it back forward. Next we'll check our magnetos. Go to the left. A little bit of drop in RPM. Right. No change. It's also good. And I briefly touch off to make sure that the ignition will cut out, but I come right back to ignition on. Sounds good. Back to both. Alright. Check your generator gauge. It should be above 0 and less than 100. Or just below 50. That's looking good. Alright, next we want to check our engine-driven fuel pump. So turn the electric boost pumps off. Fuel pressure still stays at around 15 psi. And now we want to bring it all the way down to idle. Engine should stay running at this point, and then smoothly bring it back to 2300. Looks fantastic. All right, now we're done with the run-up. Bring it back down to 1200 RPM. Wonderful. All right, make sure to turn your electric boost pump back on and close the starter cover. All right. Still on the left main tank. Everything's looking good. All right, now we can close the canopy. All right. Just do one final look around the cockpit. We want to go back to ram air now that we are on hard pavements. Radiator and oil cooler doors are still set wide open. You can set in some right rudder trim between 4 and 6 degrees, your preference. Throttle's good. Make sure to run. We're light, so we can do a no flap takeoff. We don't need to feed in any elevator trim. Fuel boost pumps on. Ignition is both. Suction's good. Temperatures. Oil pressure screen. Got hydraulic pressure. Excellent. Everything's looking good. All right. Pitot probe heat on. Gun heat as needed if it's wintertime, or if you're going to high altitude, you can toggle that on later. All right. And uncage my artificial horizon. All right. Just like the P-47 video, I'll just talk through the next set of steps before I do them. Alright, I'm going to run the engine back up to 2300 RPM, do one last quick check on the gauges, make sure everything is looking good before I commit to takeoff. Once I commit to takeoff, I'm going to release the brakes and smoothly increase the throttle up to 46 inches of manifold pressure. We are light, so we don't have to do a full power takeoff. If you were on a shorter runway, you had bombs or rockets or drop tanks on board, or it's hot outside, or a combination of those, you can do a full power takeoff and run your manifold pressure all the way up to 61 inches. That's perfectly acceptable in those conditions. But like I said, I am light today. I only got machine gun rounds and gas tanks. Just the gas that's in my internal tanks, that is. So I'm only going to use 46 inches. So stand on the brakes. $2,300. Gauges look good. All right, I'm going to commit to takeoff. Brakes off. A little bit of right rudder. Smoothly increase to 46. And now my sole focus is outside the window, keeping my track down the runway. Glance at the airspeed gauge, 75 miles an hour. Stick forward, a little bit nose level, build up some airspeed. Come on, baby. About 125, ease it off the runway. There we go. All right, positive rate, gear up. Red lights on, gears in transit. Good climb rate, gear lights out. Alright, now I can bring the RPM back to 2700. Continue my climb. Coolant looking good, oil temperature looking good. At this point I can set my cooler doors back to automatic and they will start to close and regulate the temperatures for me. Alright, here's our takeoff. Alright, so now we're up here at cruise altitude and we're going to talk about a few things. The first being fuel. So you have a left wing tank, a right wing tank, and in the P-51's case, you have a fuselage tank, which is just right back here over my left shoulder. You can just see the gauge. Kind of hard to get my head in the right position because I got a microphone in front of me right now. However, that's your 3 fuel tanks. The sequence of fuel burn in the P-51 is you need to burn the fuselage tank first before using your wing tanks. And that's if you have fuel in that tank. Reason for that is your center of gravity gets pushed too far to the rear, and that any sort of aerobatics or combat maneuvers are prohibited until you have less than 40 gallons inside that tank. So in wartime operations for the P-51, after takeoff, they would switch to the fuselage tank, burn that tank first, and then the drop tanks if they had them, and then move to the wing tanks. Whenever you're using the wing tanks, pick a time on the clock, either every 15 minutes or every 10 minutes. What you want to do is switch from one side to the other. That way you don't have an imbalance in the wings, because if you've got one wing heavier, the aircraft is going to tilt and start to bank that way that you either have to trim out or start burning gas out of that tank. Now to check the gas levels in those tanks, we just look on either side of the seat, and the right wing tank is on the right hand side. Left wing tank is on the left side. And then you can just balance them from that way. All 3 gauges are marked off in gallons. So 75 gallons in each of the wing tanks, and I think it's about 90 or 100 in the rear tank if you have it. The TF-51 will not have the fuselage tank, only the wing tanks. You have no indications for drop tanks. If you have those, you just run those until they run dry, and then you get rid of them. Alright, one last thing I want to touch on with the fuel is in here in the rearm menu. With the fuel slider at 68% in the Mustang, the left tank and the right tank will be full of fuel, but your fuselage tank in the back will be empty. If you wanted to put fuel in that tank, just increase the slider past 68% and you'll start getting fuel in that rear fuselage tank. That is just something to be aware of. And this is the same thing if you're in the mission editor and setting the loadout for the Mustang. Anything above 68% will put fuel in the rear fuel tank. Now, this does not apply to the TF-51 because, again, behind the pilot seat is a second seat meant for an instructor pilot, so they took out the gas tank to make room for that. All right, next we need to talk about manifold pressure. So the P-51 and the TF-51 feature an automatic boost pressure regulator. So, like on takeoff, and after takeoff, when I set for maximum continuous of 2700 RPM and 46 inches, the automatic boost pressure regulator will maintain 46 inches as long as it can. Now, as I climb, the air gets thinner. That's perfectly normal. Your supercharger is going to run into an altitude called the critical altitude. Above that altitude, there's just not enough air for the supercharger to maintain that boost pressure anymore. There's just not enough air molecules for it. So you'll notice that your manifold pressure will naturally start to fall once you reach that altitude. Somewhere between 14,000 and 16,000 feet, your supercharger will automatically shift into high gear. and start pulling in more air. You have to be ready for that if you're going to do high altitude work. So you notice my manifold pressure slowly starting to fall as I climb up. That's entirely normal. And right now I'm full throttle and I'm barely hanging on to 35 inches. And it's falling as we go. Now, there it goes. Supercharger just kicked into high gear. You got to be ready for that and be able to pull the throttle back to wherever you had the manifold set to. So right now the supercharger's in high speed, as indicated by the yellow light down on the instrument panel. And now we are good for high altitude work from here. Once you get above 25,000 feet, and it all depends on your air pressure outside during your mission, you'll run into that critical altitude again, and even in high speed, you're not going to be able to pull as much air down, and you're going to be limited. It's just the nature of having a supercharger. It's not like in the Jug where you had that turbocharger that got you all the way up to past 30,000 feet. But it runs really good here in the Mustang, and it's the opposite on the way back down. So if we go downhill, we got to be ready for the supercharger to drop into its low gear, and that'll change at an altitude lower than where it went into high gear. And there it goes, and then I can bring up my throttle, get my manifold pressure back to my cruise setting that I had it at. Alright, the last thing I want to talk about with manifold pressure is the correct way to increase and decrease your engine power. So right now we're in a cruise power setting. I'm going to go ahead and increase to maximum continuous. So whenever you increase power, you first have to increase your RPM if needed. So we got to go to 2700 and then 46 inches. You have to do it in that order, and what that does is prevents any excessive cylinder pressures and also combustion temperatures. If either of those two happens, that leads to detonation, which eventually leads to engine damage. It's a bad thing, and it's easily avoidable as long as you get the right sequence in increasing and decreasing power. So whenever you're increasing, it's always RPM first and then manifold pressure. Now to go back down, what we first want to do is decrease manifold pressure using the throttle, and then decrease RPM, and that's with the propeller lever. Decrease RPM, adjust manifold as needed, and there you go. That is the correct way to increase and decrease power. Now, we just touched on maximum continuous, and like I said, that is 2700 RPM and 46 inches of manifold pressure. So military power is a setting that is a much higher power output on the engine. However, it is time limited in being there, and you can reference that handy little placard on the right hand side of the canopy wall for time limitations. But for military power, it is 15 minutes. And then there is one more setting beyond that, and that is called War Emergency Power, or WEP. And War Emergency Power is an even higher power setting. The engine is producing its maximum output, and it's a very short duration that it is able to do so. For the Mustang, War Emergency Power is limited to 5 minutes max. Now, you can come out of War Emergency Power, let the engine cool down a little bit, and then you can go back and do another 5-minute burst at War Emergency Power. However, just keep in mind that is an extremely stressful condition for the engine, and if you do War Emergency Power for too much, you really risk engine damage or complete engine failure. Both of which being bad things. Complete engine failure usually means you end up going to be bailing out of your aircraft. So, in order to get into War Emergency Power, let's look at this. If you notice, there's a little wire across this little gate just in front of the throttle. That little wire existed in real life, and what that allowed is the throttle to bump up against the wire, and that would get you to military power. The pilot had to push the throttle physically past that wire. It's a little thin piece of wire, So if you push hard enough, you're going to break through that wire and push the throttle into its full range of travel. So there is a keybind within the controls that allows for that. And I'll just pan the camera. There we go. So first we're going to go to military power. And remember, RPM first. And that's pretty much full RPM, so 3,000 RPM. And then pretty much full power. And there you go. 61 inches of manifold pressure. That is military power right here. Now, if you wanted to go a little bit higher, bring the throttle back slightly, toggle that keybind for your war emergency power, and then apply full throttle. And you notice that our throttle cut through that wire and dropped into the gate. And now we are at 67 inches of manifold pressure. We can sustain this for 5 minutes, and this can really help you get out of a jam, or if you're tangling it up with enemy fighters. This is your power setting, but like I said, 5 minutes maximum at this, or you really risk engine damage. You do have to keep an eye on your engine temperatures whenever you're at the really high power settings. As you are really pushing the engine to its limits, everything's just going to run hotter. You are very likely going to have to run the oil cooler in manual mode and set that wide open, because the automatic thermostat that controls the door does not react fast enough to a sudden burst of power. And also, to go with that, the radiator door, you may have to adjust that as well. So that's just one thing to keep in mind whenever you're at the high power settings. All right, and that's all I got there on the Supercharger. As far as aircraft maneuverability, this is a very nimble aircraft, very honest aircraft, so you can yank and bake all day long, and this is just an absolute joy to fly. This is the first warbird that I purchased in DCS, and I've enjoyed it ever since I've had it. I will caution you on one thing: if you pull too hard in a turn, you will get into an accelerated stall. You can hear the gun port starting to whistle in the background there. That's your cue that you're starting to pull a little too hard. Your cockpit can start shaking, letting you know that right there. And she'll warn you that she's about to stall a wing. Your left wing will stall first, and I'll show you that. And there goes the left wing, and I go into a roll. Now, up here at altitude, it's easily recoverable. If you are down low, or especially right after takeoff, and that left wing stalls, you're going to have a nasty crash, and there's not much you can do about it at low altitude. So that's just one thing to be aware of. Other than that, she is a very forgiving airplane to fly. You have 3 axes of rudder trim. They are your friends. And you want to always set your rudder trim first, center up that ball in the turn coordinator, and then you can adjust the other 2 trim settings as you need. And that's a fair amount of what I got there on handling characteristics. I won't get into combat. I'll save that. I'll save combat for another video. This one's going to run long enough as it is. So, all right, let's go ahead and go check out how to land this puppy. Alright, here we are getting set up ready for landing. If you get lost on what to do for a landing or takeoff, you got a nice convenient checklist right underneath here on the gun sight, or if you're in a TF-51, you can just see this a heck of a lot easier. So, landing sequence, we want our mixture to run. That's where it should be normally. We send our engine RPM to 2,700. Go. Boost pump check on. Fuel. Normally on a landing, you want to make sure your fuel selector is set to the gas tank that has the most fuel in it. This is an air start. They're both full. I'm just going to leave it on the left. Radiators automatic. Temperatures are looking great. Landing gear, we can drop that at 170 miles an hour. Flaps at 165. That limitation up on the front is the flaps all the way down. Over here on our chart, flap restrictions, 20 degrees, 275, Right there, I can set 20 degrees down, and I can continue dropping the flaps as we go down. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and drop 20 degrees. There's our flaps coming down. Left side, right side. I'll come off active pause. And let's land this baby. Alright. Now, unlike the P-47, you do not have to worry about the engine bearings in a V12 engine. That is a problem that is unique to radial engines and not a limitation on these. Alright, below 200, another notch of flaps. Below 180, another notch, and I can send the gear down. Gear is down and locked. Excellent. Now for the pattern, you want to be around 150 miles an hour, and I want to trim this aircraft up. There we go. A little bit easier forces on my stick. Always trim your aircraft whenever you can, and that's good. That's a skill that just takes time. Practice with this, you'll get good at it. Alright, now I want to start descending a little bit, pull a little power. Get that last notch of flaps down. Excellent. Nice and controlled. The airfield's almost over my left shoulder before I turn to final. Right even with the tail plane. Alright, nice gentle turn to final. A little bit of rudder. Throttle is needed. You want to maintain your airspeed throughout while you're in your descending turn. You don't want to get too slow. You don't want to drop that wing and lead to a crash. Alright. Now on your final approach, crossing the fence, we want to be around 125. We're almost there. Rudder is your friend. Keep that ball centered, especially on the landing. Crossing the fence, about 125. Pull a little more power. Now we want to get into a 3-point stance for the touchdown. Do not force the landing. Hold her just off the runway, let her slow down and land on her own. Otherwise you'll bounce. There we go. Beautiful. Now once you're down, maintain straight. Full aft on the stick to keep that tail wheel planted down and help you slow down a little bit. Now, if you touch down a little too fast, you're gonna bounce, and depending on how hard you bounce, you got two choices. If you bounce hard, smoothly apply power and fly off and fly out of there and do another pattern. It is extremely difficult to salvage a bad landing in a warbird, and it's very easy to crash after a bad bounce. Now, if it's a small bounce, you can adjust your inputs as needed, like on your stick and rudders, and ease her back down onto the runway. And that's probably one of the biggest tricks with warbirds, is just nailing that landing. Is just hold them off of the runway and just float above the runway and let that speed come down on her own, and she'll naturally settle down onto her wheels, and bam, you just nailed that landing, just like you saw there. Alright, so let's go ahead and get clear of the runway so any of our wingmen can come down. And remember, forward on the stick to unlock the tail wheel, a little bit of brake. Bring the stick back to center up that wheel, and it'll automatically lock as soon as it gets into position. Taxi off the parking. Let's get our... we can leave the flaps down. And just be gentle on the brakes as you come to a stop. It's very easy to have this engine, have the airplane nose over, and you'll ruin the prop every time you do that. Or crash if it's fast enough. Alright. Now to effect the shutdown, what you want to do is prop full forward, throttle up to 1500 RPM, and then mixture to off. And then increase the throttle to full as it comes to a stop, and that'll get all the gas out of the air intake. Make it a little safer for the ground crew to operate on this thing. There's no gas left in the intake or the cylinders. Just pull the throttle back, fuel to off, and at this point you can dump the hydraulic pressure in the system and shut off your electrics. And that is it. That is all there is to flying the P-51. This is an amazing aircraft. It's very well done. This has been in DCS for quite a few years, and it is just a dream to fly. I absolutely love flying this. It's my favorite one out of the bunch. Well, there you have it, folks. Hope you guys enjoyed this. These things are an absolute joy to fly. The Mustang in particular is just awesome. Like I said earlier, it's my favorite warbird. It is the first one I ever bought in DCS as far as warbirds go. And it's just an absolute joy to fly. They do take some time to practice with and get the hang of, but very rewarding once you get the hang of it, especially running the engine. And I know that's a big piece of the challenge of flying the warbirds, is taking care of the engine. Because if you mismanage your engine, that can bring you down just as easy as getting shot down. So, again, hope you guys enjoyed this. Hope to see you in the virtual warbird skies, and we'll see you next time.